So, welcome back to the Creative Study Lab, and welcome back to the attendees who have followed us so far, starting in the morning, and welcome to the new attendees on site and online. As you know, this is a blended workshop, so we apologize for some technical inconvenience, but this is quite an experimental event for the MUCIV as well. If you want to ask questions, we ask you to use the chat function. And this workshop is being recorded, and the recording will be published on the YouTube account of the museum in the upcoming weeks. This is panel 2, devoted to collections under scrutiny, artists, activists, outsiders. I'm pleased to welcome Giulia Grechi as a keynote speech of this panel. Giulia Grechi is a cultural anthropologist. She's professor of cultural anthropology and anthropology of art at the Fine Arts Academy of Brera. She recently published this book, whose translation in English may sound like Decolonizing the Museums, Exhibitions, Artistic Practices, Embodied Gazes. Her keynote speech today will resonate with some of the crucial issues she has discussed here, and I think it is quite engaging for all of us that she starts her talk by posing a question: can a wound be exposed? Posthumous coloniality and the colonial afterlife in museums. Please, Giulia. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you to MUCIV Museum for inviting me to join this very interesting moment of confrontation, of dialogue. And I will read my speech. I'm sorry, but I think that maybe the use of English language in our academic context is one of the places we have to decolonize. By the way, I would like to start. I don't see my... Thank you very much. Okay, I would like to start my speech by showing you a scene from a movie that I know that probably everyone knows, but just to start with a little lightness. And so let's watch it together, and gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Gentlemen, let's broaden our minds.
Okay. So we can start asking ourselves, are we still alive in our contemporary museums? This scene strikes me for two reasons. One relates to a chemical question, so to speak, and the other relates more specifically to museum grammar in relation to the question of the canon. Both the chemistry and the canon have to do with the coloniality that continues to intoxicate the body of the museum. In the next few minutes, I will try to articulate a reflection from these two pillars of our museum colonial unconscious. So, have you ever felt short of air in a museum room? How much oxygen is there in an exhibition hall? And how much oxygen is consumed on average by a visitor during their visit? How does this loss of oxygen change the environment? In October 2020, Sandra Smith, head of collection care at the British Museum, said that during the period of the pandemic, without the museum's approximately 6 million annual visitors, there had been a significant change in the humidity levels of the rooms, putting the health of the exhibits at risk. Anna Chiara Cimoli writes, commenting on this news, I quote, "The objects exhibited in the museum are used to breathing along with the visitors. If the visitors disappear, the museum too will run out of oxygen." Thus, the visitors in the museum are not only eyes on legs. They have breathing and digestive systems, they have weight and volume, they smell and touch the space with their bodies, they feel it and warm it up, They are there with their own complex cultural background, with their own embodied experience of life. What does it mean when we feel that we can't breathe in the museum on a literal and metaphoric level? Perhaps what takes the breath away in museums' rooms is that purple substance that intoxicates the air we saw in the movie, a substance that we can call, quoting Achille Mbembe, colonial necropolitics. This toxic substance poisons the museum in all its metabolism, as Clementine Delis writes, giving form and legitimacy to the possession of certain objects, to certain modes of display, to certain narratives and epistemologies, to certain points of view, to certain bodies, and taking for granted the illegitimacy of others, constructing and naturalizing a set of canons as the only possible and authorized rules of the game. This purple substance is intoxicating the museum to the point where it is almost dying. But how to heal the museum body from the colonial necropolitics that affects it? With which therapist? By acting on what symptoms? And above all, is it really possible to heal the museum from colonial necropolitics? In the book by Clementine Delis, she quotes Alpha Konaré, former president of Mali and of ICOM. And when he was asked about how to heal the colonial wound, he answered, "Kill the museum." And I think this is a question around which we have to ask ourselves. Kill the model of the museum, maybe the museum that was born inside our nations during the colonial period can be destroyed in order to construct another kind of institution that is more linked to our contemporaneity. At this moment, I am talking about the museum in general as a dispositive of European national and colonial modernity. Of course, in the case of ethnographic museums, this disease takes on specific forms and variants, even more insidious, because they involve the objects and bodies and lives of other people and the material violence of colonialism more than other museums. Anyway, this is the question that informs all my research, even in the curatorial practices through which I have tried to experiment with possible paths, all played out on the margin between the museum, especially the ethnographic museum, and contemporary arts. A productive margin from which it is possible to trigger emergencies of the repressed, important awareness both of the museum and the public, but also a particularly insidious and risky margin. I am talking about the resurfacing of the repressed because when we talk about post-colonial, we are not assuming that colonialism is simply over, because we know very well colonialism is a past that does not pass. Rather, post, in my imagination, evokes the concept of posthumous, highlighting how historical colonialism has somehow survived its own death, leaving a heavy legacy and new forms of coloniality, not only in economic and political terms, but also culturally. A mutant coloniality, so to speak, which acquires different forms and is embodied in different places and languages, but which remains a founding feature of our culture. A spectre, a glimpse constantly present in the mirror in which we, Eurodescendants, reflect ourselves. I speak from the perspective of a person outside the museum structure and bureaucracy. I am not a museum practitioner, but I have often worked with museums through external curatorial projects, always done in groups together with other people, always trying to work with the museum and not on the museum. I consider the museum as a place that is bearer and producer of fundamental identity processes, which, as such, is always itself exposed as a space of enunciation to its own vulnerability, to the possibility of being interrupted, questioned, contradicted, challenged, usurped, reinvented. Therefore, the perspective from which I speak is external to the museum machine, but certainly not objective. On the contrary, I speak from a partial and positioned perspective, as a museum visitor, as an insider in another hellish machine like the university, which shares many dynamics with the museum, both being powerful devices of knowledge production, And as a Euro-descendant woman, heir, despite myself, to a toxic colonial canon that continues to haunt our institutions and reproduce itself in their practices. I'm sorry to show this image that is a very violent image. It is the actual setting of Museum of Anthropology in Naples, and these are facial casts. These are one of the most violent objects we produced in our discipline during the period the colonial period. And I'm sorry to show it because it is a violent image, but I show it just to testify how many museums has a strong difficulty to understand the violence inside the objects of their collections. Colonialism has been profoundly material and sensorial. Bodies and objects have always been at the center of the colonial project, often sharing the same status: racialized and sexualized bodies to be disciplined and exploited, raw materials, artifacts and works of art to be saved, foodstuffs, photographs, documents, bodies and pieces of bodies, in an economy that is also perceptive, sensorial, involving not only sight but also sounds, smells, tastes and contact. The museum, as a key institution of European colonial modernity that classifies and controls the cultures of the world, has imposed not only its own construction of knowledge, but also its own sensory hierarchies, inside on objects and outside on the public. The museum naturalized the specific Western sensory hierarchy, the sensory model of the five senses assumed to be universal, even though it is not, contributing to define a disembodied gaze as the privileged sense of scientific knowledge and museum experience, relegating the other senses to subordinate positions or to the realm of the forbidden. This process was functional in defining the self and the other. It served to construct and naturalize the superiority of the civilized, rational, European male viewing subject over the smelling, touching, tasting, sexualized, irrational other. Colonial power also acts on perception, on feeling, and the museum is one of its favorite playrooms. The ethnographic object inside the museum thus appears in some way civilized, though it remains other, relocated in the rational regime of the museum, and so also the populations it represents will be symbolically disciplined, that is, immobilized, frozen in the representation that the museum constructs for them through lifeless objects. Such a museum space also invests the visitors with a power and a privilege. The visitors are reflected in a representation that portrays them as belonging to a superior civilization compared to the others, thus compensating them for possible social injustices within their social world, and so they can come and go in the museum as they please, while, here I'm quoting Classen and Oes, I quote, the collection remains trapped, captive, the canoe hangs still from the ceiling, the drum is silent on the wall, the amulet is powerless in its case, end of quote. It is impossible to conceive a museum display able to avoid questions of power and misrepresentations. This is even more true in the case of ethnographic museums, with their original sin of complicity with colonialism, which is configured in museum displaying as something intractable. The urgencies are evident and loudly expressed by activist groups, search communities, diasporic communities, researchers and artists who are questioning the museum, ethnographic or otherwise, about contested heritage, about the question of restitutions and repairs, about coloniality in the construction of narrations and spaces, interior but also architectural, like here in this place we are now, about the racialization and precarization of the museum workers and the need for a more embedded fruition, where both the colonial gaze and colonial sensoriality can be criticized. The canons can and must be rethought in the light of the new awareness and the new diasporic and transcultural structure of our societies. Decolonizing implies a simultaneous effort to decanonize. While these urgencies are sometimes too slowly, like here in Italy, being addressed, what can we do in the meantime to open a conversation about them, to raise awareness of their necessity? In my research and in my practices as curator, I wondered about the operation that can resemantize discourses, objects, bodies, and spaces in the museum, still strongly marked by a colonial trace, by deactivating their power and effectiveness. I would like to propose to you a few specific cases of experimentation which pose us questions or trace a possible path around this scattered colonial body. Here we are in Rimini, a near town in Emilia-Romagna. Museo degli Sguardi, gazes, Museum of the Gazes. This is the first room of the museum. My gaze stops in front of a strange display case. It is opaque. There are objects on display, but I can only just make out their outlines. So I try to focus my attention precisely on that opaque margin, on the very gaze that the museum constructs for its objects and for its public. The museum has historically cannibalized objects, especially the ethnographic museum. What does the museum really know about these objects, their lives, which some Europeans have appropriated in often illicit ways? The transparency of museum glass cases is an illusion, as is the presumed innocence of display. It masks the appropriative gaze of colonial Europe on otherness. My gaze in front of this opaque showcase goes out of focus and thus paradoxically can see better. It becomes aware of itself and what implications there are behind the museum's narrative, trapped in a Eurocentric and colonial gaze. Yet, perhaps, even that opaque showcase is not enough. What else can the ethnographic museum do apart from acknowledging all this and showing it with intelligence, self-criticism, and a certain amount of irony? I'm sure certain objects feel uncomfortable behind the museum showcase. That opaque showcase is not enough. I think we need to start feeling deeply uncomfortable in museum rooms. Like in the Uncomfortable Art Tours by Alice Proctor, in which the artist reveals coloniality made invisible through the canonization of certain characters or works of art considered emblematic of English culture and art history. In the words of the artist, and here I quote, "In a country that's repeatedly failed to come to terms with its colonial past, led by politicians who seem to think the past is the future, we seek to resist a triumphalist nostalgia with art history. How did the narratives of empire come into being? Who controls them? And how can we learn to see through the whitewash to the truth? These tours focus on how major institutions came into being against the backdrop of imperialism. On each tour, we unravel the role colonialism played in shaping and founding a major national collection, looking at the broader material history of celebrated works, where the money comes from, the ways they've been displayed, and the ideological aesthetics at work. The history of British art is also the history of empire and genocide, written by collectors who traded in landscape and lives." End of quote. During tours or on her website, the artist offers people tools to question the museum more directly about captions, the transparency of information about the acquisition of works and narratives. To quote the artist again, "Display it like you stole it" is a call for museums to rethink the politics of display in their galleries, from label text to lighting. How is ownership created and dissent shut down? Who is the authorial voice here, and what is considered worthy of inclusion? It's well past time for museums to be honest about their acquisitions history and how objects arrived in their collections in the first place. End of quote. I believe that it is useful for the museum to experiment with practices of remediation, not only through the use of technologies and multimedia displays, but through a gaze outside the museum, of an artist, a curator, a person from the source communities, an activist, that sees in another way, sees something else in the object collected and exhibited. and is able to transgress the coloniality imbued in the museum gaze and to trigger new imaginations, new aspirations. And here I'm quoting Arjuna Pardurai. The risk of these processes of remediation lies in the relationship with the museum institution, which often cannibalizes the critical work of the person, artist or activist or sub-communities, without really questioning the underlying power structure, rather continuing to reproduce it in a more hygienic way. It will benefit its public image, apparently cleaned of colonial waste, in a process of facade but not substance. It is not a matter of creating inclusive practices or exhibitions. It is a matter of stepping back, of using one's position of privilege to open up spaces, to act on power structures at all levels within the institution, to decanonize it. Only making visible difference within a path that is only apparently inclusive and participatory is but another form of objectification, which leaves the system of reproduction of knowledge unchanged, to the point of reproducing a new form of coloniality and appropriation, even more subtle and insidious, because it superficially restores the image of the museum as an inclusive place. In short, a dangerous and violent form of tokenism. I would like to conclude by recounting two performances that took place here in the spaces of Mucib Museum. The first one, Ricollezioni, by Leone Contini. He's an artist and an anthropologist. Took place right here in the small rooms and the small archives of the colonial collection here, right on the stairs, where I think today or tomorrow you will see a new installations above these objects of the former colonial collection, of the former colonial museum. Ricollezioni is a sort of performative guided tour of the colonial collection kept in these small deposits of the Pigorini Ethnographic Museum, while waiting for the museum to realize the project of its new exhibition in a new area of the museum. This performance was realized ad hoc within Resurface Post-Colonial Gazes, a program of events that I created together with Viviana Gravano, that is a contemporary, an historian of contemporary art, and Salvo Lombardo, who is a performer and a choreographer, here in the spaces of the Mucib. Each visit of Ricollezioni, each performance, is for a maximum of 5 spectators at a time and takes place in one of the collection storerooms, usually inaccessible to the public. There are these 2 little doors you can see on the stairs. You enter a rather narrow space. Once through the door, you find yourself in the dark, inside a place of which you perceive almost nothing, except for its small size, perhaps the smells, those of a small windowless space full of objects from other eras, which you may glimpse in the dark, classified and stored inside boxes, trolleys, cases. The artist closes the door behind him and begins to narrate from inside the darkness its many meanings. I quote its own words. His voice will sound better than mine, but this is not the artificial darkness in which the African sections of European ethnographic museums are immersed, the mystifying darkness of Black Africa, l'Afrique fantôme, mysterious Africa, ghost Africa. If there is a ghost here, it is me. In this storeroom, the ghost is that of the white man, of the colonizer. First of all, then, this is the darkness of our colonial amnesia, and more concretely, also the cognitive darkness that surrounds these objects, about which we know almost nothing. It is also a darkness of respect, to protect certain objects that are not supposed to be exposed, such as the glasses of Omar al-Mukhtar, the leader of the anti-Italian insurgency in Cyrenaica, who was brutally hanged. So in this sense, it is a darkness of caution and respect, but it is also a darkness that protects me and you from some of the fiercest ghosts that inhabit the storeroom. Among them, real-world criminals, never punished, sometimes judged, but never really punished, whose effigies were cast in solemn bronze busts, which I will not show today. That is why the visit will take place in the dark. End of quote. The artist then uses a small torch to illuminate details of objects stolen from the colonial territory, discs of madreperla that will become buttons, shells, leopard skins, raw materials that the colonialist skill will elaborate into finished products, such as a series of elegant women's shoes made from local animal skins into haute couture models. Fleetingly illuminated objects which we can barely glimpse but never observe. Objects on whose skin the museum's skin has been superimposed, cellophane bags, labels, boxes, wrappings intended to protect and preserve their integrity, but also significant of the new discursive regimes that the museum literally inscribes on each one. Here, to see the object is to see the museum and its violence. The artist concludes with a subversive image, thinking of the objects of the colonial collection as subjects, bodies, with their agency and projects. Perhaps the darkness that envelops these objects in the museum's storeroom is also a darkness of contamination, in which the objects can somehow reconnect with each other, challenging the museum curators, conspiring behind their backs, plotting against visitors, meditating escapes in the dark while no one is watching. This small immersive experience in a physical place, which is at the same time an epistemological place and an archive of our imaginaries, is a provocative and in some ways deeply disturbing perceptive experience. By questioning the primacy of sight, of an objectifying or contemplative mode of observation, and by soliciting an embodied perception, it places the spectators in a condition of vulnerability and discomfort, which becomes potentially disruptive. The expectations of classical museum fruition are disregarded to leave room for powerful synesthetic perception, which acts simultaneously on a sensory and emotional level, partially inhibiting observation and soliciting an understanding that passes through the whole body. It is no longer just a matter of seeing the object, but of feeling it, of thinking through objects with the senses. Thus, in the space of this temporary yet very strong intimacy, the people who took part in the performance often felt free to intervene, to interrupt the flow of discourse, to disagree, to engage in real discussions with the artist in the dark, side by side, allowing personal memories and family stories to emerge, school reminiscences, and political or ideological points of view on the past, but also on the present, recognizing the multiple and contradictory links of those objects, those bodies, and those stories with today, that is, with ourselves. The torch makes only fragments of this scattered colonial body barely visible, opening and closing sudden glimpses of meaning for those who, in the dark, experience another kind of gaze, a tactile gaze, which touches and is touched by matter, smells, stories, history, by the breath and bodies of the people next to it, by the voice of the artist, by the ghosts, the crowd, that small room, by what has been made invisible and silenced inside the object, a gaze that perhaps in this way is able to imagine, questioning the darkness and penetrating it in order to understand it better. The last performance, and I am going to conclude, is for Colonial Dances seen up close. MK is an independent performance and choreography research group, and they created and performed this dance piece for Colonial Dances seen up close in the museum spaces here among the display cases with the exhibits. A few years ago in the Ethnographic Museum Pigorini, while we were curating this palimpsests of exhibitions and events and performance with many contemporary artists crossing bodies post-colonial visions. What they call colonial dances are choreographic tales that ironically rework the colonial gestures and postures interiorized and unconsciously reenacted in an apparently innocent form by tourists and consumers of the global cultural tourism. Those imaginaries linked to the encounter with difference that constitute a sort of underground script ready to be reenacted in tourist village rituals, safaris, exotic shows, or maybe also in ethnographic museums. What is distant is always close to something else, they say. Bodies traces distances and bridge them, negotiating their relationship with space, which is also a discursive space inhabited by power-related imaginaries and stereotypes. These issues acquire a particular resonance in the context of an ethnographic museum, a space normally not designed for contemporary dance. In the Pigorini space, just before entering the museum halls, among the display cases with some of the objects on show, the 4 colonial dances interrupt the usual flows of the museum space and its temporality, opening up the possibility of a different sensory experience of fruition, completely anomalous, overturning the museum necropolitics into an ironic vitality, where the movement of the bodies marks the constant work of self-translation in the instability of every journey towards or against the other. The performance resignifies museum objects in a critical way. The bollards, a sign of prohibition and interdiction of the museum control over bodies and objects, are used by MK as tangible signs of the scene. They mark the ring in which the dancers enter to perform, and the outside station where one of the performers is stationary, dressed, and posed in a military way in an attitude of control. However, they are not simply scenic objects, they are subjects of power. They speak of the power of the museum to construct identities and differences, classifications that are the basis of racism. Behind the bollard, a man in a cloak, boot, and military hat stands erect, arms crossed, observing the empty ring and then the performers. He is the subject. The performers in the ring are the objects of this colonial grammar. He is motionless, glacial, looking at everything and yet remaining sideways, almost unseen. Like the rhetoric of classical ethnographic language, with its Cartesian gaze that resembles the eye of a disembodied god, vertical, omniscient, and transparent, constituting itself as a norm, as a canon. This is also the gaze of the classic ethnographic museum. The ring on the floor of the ethnographic museum tells us that the museum is a battlefield and a stage at the same time. The performance invites us to look closely at the apparent neutrality of the museum display, revealing its ideological load and at the same time subverting it. The performance draws also attention to the bodies that cross and inhabit the museum space, and which cannot be reduced to objects to be disciplined, regulated, or educated. And who knows, maybe even the objects in the museum's showcases might have felt for a moment freed from their violent objectification, so much so that I might have lightly suggested a dance step. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Giulia, for inspiring but also forcing us to interrogate and challenge our comfort zone, both as privileged museum professionals and privileged visitors, I would say. So I think there will be questions for you at the end of the panel. So I now thank you, and I'm pleased to welcome Kareena Durand, who should be connected with us.
I'm here if you can see me or hear me.
Yes.
I can hear you very well.
Yes.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Kareena Durand is Chief Curator at the Ethnographic Museum of Geneva, also called MEG. She has conducted long-term anthropological field research, crossing the boundaries of disciplines between social anthropology, education, performance studies, and art. Her talk will be about the temporary exhibition that recently opened at MEG, Environmental Injustice, Indigenous Peoples' Alternatives. It will focus on the principle that was adopted throughout the development of the exhibition and its participatory process. So, Kareena, please. Thanks.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen and I'll be with you in a minute. I think you can all see it properly. Okay.
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah, fantastic. Yep. Thank you. So thank you so much. Yes, indeed. The main topic of my talk today is about a principle which is totally ingrained into United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also in other international rights, international conventions and declaration, which is what we call very quickly the FPIC, but also is called the Free, Prior and Informed Consent. And what I'm proposing today is to show how this principle was adopted in the exhibition we've been developing over 2 years, and how it has become a museum practice. It is the main poster of the exhibition. The exhibition is called Environmental Injustice, Indigenous Peoples' Alternatives. It just opened to the public in September. And it's going to be shown until late August 2022 at the MEG in Geneva. The main focus of the exhibition is about the way Indigenous peoples around the world are among the most vulnerable people when it comes to dealing with climate change and environmental degradations. Indigenous peoples are about 500 million individuals throughout the world, and they are facing incredible environmental injustice. And this environmental injustice threatens their economies, health, and cultures. As I said earlier, they are particularly vulnerable to environmental injustice and climate change because they're very much dependent on their natural resources for their health, culture as well. And one main point in this exhibition we wanted to make is like, while Indigenous peoples represent merely 6% of the global population of the Earth, they take care of 80% of the biodiversity of a planet. This was the main point of the exhibition. And quite a few months before starting developing the project of the exhibition, I was fortunate enough to meet with Andrea Carmen, who is the executive director of an organization called International Indian Treaty Council. And Andrea was very much interested in creating a new human rights framework and protocols for exhibiting, cataloging, but also repatriating human remains and sacred items. That was a main focus and a main interest. That's why we started to talk together about the way museums like ourselves, which we work in an ethnographic museum, museums like ourselves could be interested in working on a more human rights-based approach. And on the other side, from our side, we were very much interested in putting together an exhibition that would contribute to implement human rights practices and human rights-based approach in our work as well. So we met together, and Andrea drafted a document, and I'm going to come back to this document a bit later, talking about these ongoing challenges that she could notice in her document and the recommendations she did for several museums. And while developing this exhibition, we decided to adapt and to adopt this recommendation. And one of this recommendation, the main one, was to see how museums like our museum could use the human rights framework as it is drafted in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is what I'm going to develop now. But before this, there are three main challenges she noticed, and of course we noticed as museum practitioners as well, that make it very difficult sometimes and still for indigenous peoples to interact collaboratively with museums. The first main challenge is that when it comes to sacred items, sacred objects, and human remains, this is what happened a lot in our museums. Many human remains and with our people and ancestors are still considered as artifacts. And as Andrea noted, they are considered as artifacts rather than, vital elements of still living cultures with their own living spirits. The second point that was particularly important to us was to consider that the burden of proof for the ownership or identity of sacred items and human remains is still very much placed on indigenous peoples rather than on her museums. This was another point, and more importantly, when it comes to repatriation issues. And then the third, the recorded provenance of the items from our collections, and even more when it comes to sacred items and human remains, is often incorrect or inaccurate. And this can cause additional challenges, of course, for indigenous peoples to locate and identify or present claims for repatriation. So starting from these challenges, we decided to proactively adopt this principle, which is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. So in doing this, we decided to use this principle as a very guiding methodology for the development of the exhibition. And we decided to use this principle on 3 different settings. The first one was to set up an advisory committee, which was aimed at guiding us throughout the development of the exhibition. And we had this possibility to work with 4 indigenous peoples experts, Lourdes Belkacem, who is the African expert for the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples at the UN. Andrea Carmen, I already talked about her. She's the executive director of this International Indian Treaty Council. We also had the chance to work with Myrna Cunningham, who works in Nicaragua, and Jennifer Linge, who works as a curator at the Sabah Art Gallery in Malaysia. Another way of implementing this prior informed consent was to work with several artists, several indigenous peoples artists who were invited, and we commissioned some of them to create new artworks as well for the exhibition. But they contributed as well to the exhibition in another way, which is the script of the exhibition was very much developed with the input of the artists themselves. So they were invited to contribute to the exhibition writing and scripts, and also text and labels, for example. And another way of adopting this principle was to work with these 10 individuals you can see here on the screen who were interviewed by distance throughout the time of the exhibition development, and they agreed to be interviewed and also then to develop with us some part of the exhibition content as well. Maybe something I would like to share with you, because this is an ongoing concern I've been having for the past 20 years now, working in different museum settings. And how can we adopt this human rights-based approach throughout all practices? In this specific case of the exhibition development, adopting the free, prior, and informed consent while the exhibition was being developed was not much of an issue, because everyone, of course, in our own environment, museum was totally open and very happy to co-construct and co-create this exhibition with as many partners as we could do, as we wanted. The challenge comes when the exhibition opens. After the exhibition opens, it is something I've been noticing and witnessing over the past years working in different museums. There might be an implication and difficulty in keeping on applying this principle of consent when the exhibition is open. Just a tiny example to give you an idea. Regarding the different individuals we interviewed, there was one point when, from our recent consent, the agreement we signed and they signed, said that they would give us the authority and to be able to exploit their image for the exhibition, but also after the exhibition opening. But then it leaves the question open is whether museum staff will have the same input to seek the consent of the people over and over again, even sometimes after 20 years after the exhibition opening. This is a question opened, and I don't have the answer yet, but this is a question I wanted to just throw open so we could discuss about it maybe. And then another thing which is quite important for us, and that's why I started working with Andrea Carmen at first, was to make sure that when we select items to be exhibited, we take great care of not displaying any sacred items if we don't seek and obtain the consent of the community involved. And while the exhibition was already up and running, we received a message from one of a partner who authorized the loan of a bag which is part of its collection. And this museum is doing a provenance research at the moment, and it's just managed to identify the person who made this bag in the 19th century. And it came that the bag was considered as a sacred item. So we were asked to remove the bag from the display case after the exhibition opening, which we did without any question. But the thing I wanted to share with you here is whether museums are ready to consider the additional costs which goes with this capacity of rearranging display cases depending on the relationship they have with different communities. If one community is actively engaged as a partner and ask a museum to remove an item because it's considered as being sacred, museums need to get enough money aside, I would say, to be able to readapt this display case as early as possible. This is kind of question I wanted to share with you. Regarding the overall recommendations, to be able to adopt this human rights-based approach in our practice, I have decided to just select some of the recommendations that were shared with to us by Andrea Carmen that I found particularly interesting in dealing and developing exhibitions, but also cataloging our collections or researching them. This is something I find interesting, that all aspects concerning museum exhibitions involving indigenous peoples, cultural heritage, that includes the planning process for new exhibitions, for example, and the display of items currently being exhibited shall be carried in accordance with the rights affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Working in museums over the years, I've realized that quite still few of my colleagues actually know that there are many articles in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples dealing directly with the way museums should work with Indigenous peoples. Then a second point would be like museum exhibition be developed and implemented with the full and effective engagement and the famous free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned. And another question would be like museums should inform Indigenous peoples and will inform Indigenous peoples as to where and under what circumstances their sacred items and human remains are being displayed or stored. And another point which is quite important, that museum respect and take time to respect the information provided by the Indigenous peoples concerned based on their own laws, traditions and customs regarding their own sacred items. This is a very important point, that just respecting this information provided. And as I already said, this is the main point of this talk today, is like as an overarching principle, museums should not display human remains or burial items without the free, prior and informed consent of the related Indigenous peoples. And I'm very much interested in this fact that need to seek and obtain the consent of the indigenous peoples in order not to display human remains or burial items. It happens, and it had happened in our own museum, that we were given consent to show and display human remains. And I think it's important to notice here that indigenous people themselves should tell us museum professionals whether we should or not display these items. And on this last point, I should thank you, all of you, for your time and attention. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Kareena, for your reflexive contribution about the process of consultation which was implied in the making of the exhibition, and also for sharing with us the obstacles you had to meet and to face. So for you as well, I think there will be questions at the end of the panel. So thank you again. And I welcome now Christina Damilano. Are you here? Okay.
Yes.
I can see you. Okay. Christina is the president of the European Centre for Cultural Organization and Management, ECOM. She's an expert in European cultural policy and programs and has been involved in several European-funded projects and studies with a specific reference to cultural access, participation, and audience development. Her presentation is about Contested Desires, a project funded by the European program Creative Europe, as well as Taking Care. And we are curious to know how it is contributing to foster the sharing of cultural heritage. So, Christina, please.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, for the presentation, and thanks, Museo delle Civiltà, for the invitation. It's been a pleasure listening to the previous interventions. I am going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes.
So today I'm going to present, as Anna Maria said, Contested Desires, which is a small-scale Creative Europe funded project. I'm not getting into the details of what Creative Europe is and how it works. I'm taking it for granted. But anyway, just to briefly recap, it's the only European Union program completely devoted to cultural activities. And when I say small scale, I mean a project which was meant to last 2 years. And now, of course, it's been prolonged because we had to interrupt it due to the pandemic. I am part of ECOM, which is one of the partners of Contested Desires. ECOM is a small research center, is an independent research center based in Rome. And my background is archaeology and museology. And as Anna Maria said, I've been working on the issue of audience development, audience engagement, participation, accessibility for the last 25 years of my professional life. Being a small-scale project, Contested Desires involves a small number of partners, and these partners are mainly artist producers, D6 in the UK, Xarkis in Cyprus, LAC in Portugal, Labon in Spain, and Fresh Milk in Barbados. And then, of course, there is ECOM, which is not an organization producing artists, but we are in charge in this particular case of the research and the capacity building part of the project. Now, what's the aim of Contested Desires? Well, actually, we were all, the partners, we were all deeply interested in this issue of how contemporary art could, let's say, promote a different understanding of our colonial histories and how it could tackle, let's say, the impact that the colonial past has had on our understanding of European cultural heritage and identity. So the objective was quite ambitious, let's say, but we decided, since the project is a limited project in terms of time scale, in terms of funding, we decided to tackle it from the point of view of 9 contemporary artists that have been selected by the project partners at the beginning of the project itself. Here are the partners. I'll show you some pictures of where the partners are located. D6, of course, it's an artist-producer organization, but they are dealing very much also with heritage, since they are located exactly next to the rest of Hadrian's walls. So they work with contemporary artists also on the re-semantization, let's say, of this monument. LAC is based in Portugal, and they also produce contemporary artists. Xarkis is a festival organization which deals mainly with a festival in the middle of Cyprus, which is a festival engaging the whole community of this small little village, Polistipos, in the middle of the island. And then Fresh Milk. Fresh Milk is located in Barbados, and the reason why we included Fresh Milk in the partnership, I guess it's quite clear to most of you. It's because we wanted to discuss colonial issues, and we didn't want to be only Europeans discussing it. And of course, we didn't have the strength and the dimension to include more non-European partners, but luckily enough, we were able to include Fresh Milk, which is another organization producing and promoting artists in the Caribbean. La Bonne is an organization which works mainly with gender issues and also deals with the, let's say, role of heritage in defining gender power structures. So it was very important for us to have also La Bonne, based in Barcelona, dealing with this particular topic. And here are the La Bonne girls. ECCOM, this is a picture of François Matarazzo carrying out a workshop for ECCOM. François is working with me. I don't know if you are familiar with his work, but he's an expert in participatory art, participatory processes. So we are the ones dealing with capacity building within ECCOM. Contested Desires has been conceived as a project articulated into mainly 5 activities. The first one was a research part, the second one, the capacity building program, and then the residencies for the 9 selected artists, 8 from Europe and 1 from Barbados, and the exhibitions connected with these residencies experiences. And of course, we would have liked to have some symposia during the project lifetime, but most of this program had to be changed due to the pandemic. Luckily enough, the research and capacity building activity could be realized, even though in a sort of, let's say, creative way. The background research was delivered by ECCOM, and it was a small piece of research, small but quite meaningful, I would say, dealing with issues such as European cultural policy models, namely the cultural democracy policy model, and debating issues such as access, participation, representation, and legitimization of different voices in reinterpreting, re-semantizing, let's say, also designing the meanings of cultural heritage. And there is also a part of this research which is about audience development intended not as a means to increase the numbers of visitors, but as a means to create relationship between cultural organizations, cultural institutions, and communities, namely local communities. So we were able to deliver this part of research, and this part of research actually informed the 3 capacity building events that ECOM was in charge of. One was about how heritage, in a way we could say, defines, create identities, shape identities. The second capacity building event was about heritage and the crafting of nations, the creation of nations, the concept of nation states in Europe, and the role that heritage had in creating those concepts. And the third one was about heritage and gender issues, power structures connected to gender. Now, only the first one could be delivered in presence. The other 2 workshops were delivered online, and this, of course, had an impact on the results of those workshops. At the same time, the COVID-19 crisis had an impact on the residencies and the exhibitions. We were able only to have the one in Lagos in Portugal. We had to postpone the one in Newcastle in the UK and to cancel the one in Spain. We still hope we will be able to have a long residency in Cyprus for all the artists who should work together with that community in the little village that I showed you before, Polistipos. Here I'm showing you the artists who are from Portugal, from the UK, from Cyprus, from Spain, and from Barbados. And they are all visual artists, mainly visual artists. Now, what can I say about the project? Of course, we are not still able to evaluate its impact. But for sure, I can tell you something which is strongly perceived as missing in this project. It's missing because of many reasons, mainly because it's a small-scale project, as I said, with a limited scope. But I personally felt that this was sort of undermining the whole project since the very beginning. There are no cultural institutions involved in the discussion. What does it mean? That even when we discussed with the artists about how their practices could provide a new meaning, a new reading of heritage, and we could do it only in Lagos, where we actually met people representing institutions in the country, in the city, which are strongly related to the history of the city and obviously the history of slavery in that particular case. But institutions and museum professionals were never involved in the discussions with the artists. They were part of workshops, of panels. They expressed their own ideas, but they didn't work together with the artists. Therefore, the result of that particular residency and the following exhibition was, as far as I'm concerned, a little too self-referential, meaning that the artists decided what they wanted to tell, what kind of stories, what kind of aspects they wanted to, let's say, underline, which is fine because that was the reason why we selected them. But I think it would have been beneficial to have institutions as counterparts. We have heard from Giulia Grechi how fruitful is this encounter when it happens between institutions and artists. I think within Contested Desires, this is missing. The other thing which is missing, and again, for the reasons I already explained, is the relationship or a sort of engagement with audiences. Actually, the only moment in which these artists will be able to discuss their vision of heritage in a post-colonial perspective will be in Cyprus, if we manage to travel to Cyprus. Otherwise, there have been no other occasions during which this has been possible. That's why we've been thinking of a next Contested Desires, which we called Contested Desires Difficult Conversations. So we've been applying for another Creative Europe grant, but this time we have selected institutions as partners of the consortium, and Museo delle Civiltà would be hopefully one of them, because we really thought this was an important aspect missing in this edition of the project. And we have also included audiences and the role of audiences in discussing, in defining, in shaping the activities that the artists will carry out, within the participating museums. We don't know whether this proposal will be funded or not. Obviously, we have to wait, but we think that on the basis of what we have learned during these first 18 months of Contested Desires first version, we think it would be very important to go a bit, let's say, beyond the objectives of this first project, including institutions and audiences, as I said before. So this is it from my side. Obviously, you can find information about the project also on our website or on the project's website, and I am obviously at your disposal if you wish to ask questions on the project. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, thank you, Christina, for your reflexive and critical insight in this project. And I think it could be interesting to know a little more about the origins of the title and how desires and contestation were assumed by the project actors. So maybe I anticipate a question, but it's a personal curiosity I would like to share. So thank again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I invite here Ralph Cheplak-Menzin. Please join us. I will introduce him. Ralph is curator of collections from Asia, Oceania, and Australia in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum. He is the chair of ICOM-ICM, International Committee for Museums and Collections of Ethnography, and he will talk about the recent activist residency that was hosted by the museum and Kanika Gupta's experience within the framework of the Taking Care project. Kanika Gupta is also connected with us, so we can see her. And we are really grateful for that, and we thank her. And she will be pleased to answer your questions at the end of Ralph's speech, as well as Ralph, of course, if you wish. So please, Ralph.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad that I came here. And yes, I will present Kanika Gupta's work in our museum. Can you please show the PowerPoint? Okay. Well, you can see here is a photo of Kanika. She is an Indian activist in residence in our museum, Slovene Ethnographic Museum. At the 24th ICOM General Conference in Milan 2016, I met Ms. Kanika Gupta for the first time. We had very interesting talks, so even after the conference, we stayed in contact. In 2018, we started in the Slovene Ethnographic Museum in collaboration with the Slovene Academy of Science to work on a project called Slovenian Missionaries in India, a forgotten chapter in intercultural relations. In this context, we could invite Ms. Gupta to Slovenia, and we researched over 500 Indian prints from the 30s, which were collected by Slovenian missionaries in Bengal. Here you can see some of these prints, which we researched. They came actually in the 30s from India, from Bengal, through the missionaries, and they were first exhibited in the Missionary Museum in Slovenia. But after the Second World War, they closed that museum and they were confiscated, and later on they came to our museum, to Slovene Ethnographic Museum. So mostly they served to introduce Indian culture, but actually from a very negative point of view, because, you know, the Christian missionaries, they were expanding the Christianity in India, and then they showed about the Indian gods and so on and so on. It's very interesting that in the so-called Bengali Indian missionary collection, there are quite many famous Indian actresses from that time. That was a surprise for us, that the Christian missionaries, they were collecting even the actresses. On June 27, 2021, Kanika Gupta, Indian activist, art historian, trained dancer, and filmmaker, arrived in Ljubljana with a 2 months delay because of COVID-19. Here she was. It was really very complicated, because at first we thought that she will come a year earlier, but you know, I mean, COVID-19 changed the world. In her research, Ms. Gupta illuminates ancient knowledge that can be traced in Indian museum collections and shows its relevance for today's global environmental challenges. Here we show a book she wrote with another colleague, Deepak Kanal, about the unknown master sculptures in ancient India. Due to the pandemic, her residency has been postponed 2 times, and we organized an online pre-program, a conversation, a lecture, and a film screening to share some of the outcomes of our collaboration. Here you can see her and Tina Palajic, who is the coordinator of Taking Care project in our museum. Unfortunately, she couldn't come. She wanted to come with me, but she got sick, but not of COVID, thanks God. After her arrival, we did thorough research of the Indian collection in our museum. We analyzed and photographed 846 objects. It's very different objects, from textiles to small sculptures, religious sculptures, miniatures, I mean, many different things. Also jewelry, you can see Kanika tried some of this jewelry. In between, Ms. Gupta showed us a documentary film. It was in spring with the debate afterwards, a performance, The Cursed Land of Lustful Women, and she shared ancient Indian poetry on trees during her performance and collected 3 poems from the audience in Slovene and English, which was compiled in a folder and is preserved in the museum archives to make and spread awareness of the vulnerable nature. Here you can see the screenshots. And these are the replies to her 3 poetry. Here you can read, "Afraid of midday heat, even our shadow stays under your feet. Come into the shade, traveler." It's a verse from India. And there it's interesting, some of the responses, like Enrico Maria Milic responded, "In August I have been in Ljubljana for the event of Kanika Gupta, art historian and dancer. Her performance was based on her telling and dancing around traditional Indian stories dedicated to the relationship with nature. The stories she shared are particularly useful for understanding something more about the age of global warming, or better, the significance of the ordinary connection with nature of human communities before industrialization. The card in the gallery was part of the performance. Thanks, Kanika, for sharing and making us emotional and thinking about these topics. And Kanika, she made also many different performs, not only in our museum and around, but also in other parts of Slovenia. So thank you very much. And maybe now Kanika will be on stage.
Oh yes, if Kanika, if you would like to add something, your point of view about this experience, since Ralph was quite quick in his presentation. So you have a few minutes, about 10 minutes if you want to add something.
Yes, thank you so much to Ralph for making this presentation and talking about my work. I think it was a most learning experience for all of us here in the museum, Ralph, Tina Palaich, and myself working on this residency. I realized that Slovenia is really fond of poetry, and there are so many poets that I came across in Slovenia. And I was wanting to work around the issues of deforestation. And my folklore and narratives that I picked from India revolve around this. So therefore, I decided to also take some poetry from ancient India. And because I was sharing poetry from India, I also wanted to hear poetry from my audience, especially in Slovenia, which is why we collectively also introduced something like a poetry contest in Slovene and English, as Ralph already told you. So I think it was an extremely enriching experience, and people from Slovenia, people are so wonderful here. They contributed very, very generously. And I really thank the people of Slovenia for that. Yeah, and I'd only like to add that when we talk about non-European collections, and I wanted to contribute as an artist and as an activist, I wanted to keep to the aesthetics of the tradition that I come from. I think the aesthetic intervention or the aesthetic colonialization is very important that we ignore, I feel, many times. Aesthetics is one of the most powerful tools through which colonization takes place. And I wanted to address that in my work as well. And I hope I've been able to do a little bit of it. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are.
Thank you, Kanika, for your important words. And I thank you both for presenting us a possible and factual way of working on the issues that are at the core of the Taking Care project, of which this Creative Study Lab is also a part of. So now we can open the questions and answers session. So I first ask on-site attendees if they have some questions for our speakers. Feel free. So Ralph, please, you can join us here.
Yes, I have a question. We are talking all the time about indigenous groups, about indigenous people, actually, peoples. And I think that we are doing maybe a kind of a false generalization. Because who are these indigenous people? I mean, we are now deconstructing the ethnographic, the old style colonial ethnographic museums, and doing restitution and things like that. And we talk about indigenous people, so we should, I don't know, give back their cultural heritage. But who they are? We are artificially homogenization. We make a homogenization of these people. They are diverse. There are many, many different peoples. Let's say just in Australia, there are, I don't know how many 100 different peoples with different cultures, different languages. So let's say, I don't know, museum has boomerang, and so to whom give it back, you know? I mean, it's also a kind of colonial thinking that we are generalizing too much everything.
Thank you, Ralph. Nora? So, Nora Haas from Weltmuseum Wien.
Hi, thank you so much for this very diverse panel with a lot of different aspects, and I'm looking forward also to share some of this on our homepage for the Taking Care project. My question is to you, Julia, to speak a little bit more about the first project you were talking about. I would really like to hear what the reactions were of those groups going through the darkness, and you were also speaking about there being sort of very personal things opening up, and I was wondering if you could expand on that, because it was very, very interesting for me to hear how that developed with the audience itself.
Thank you very much, Nora, for your interest. And it was really a strong connection with people who participated in these performances. A strong connection in both senses, in a positive way, but also in a conflictual way. I mean, this kind of performance in this kind of intimacy and in the dark let people could feel free to express themselves about this topic of colonialism, and to raise all the ambiguities of feelings about colonialism, between nostalgia, sense of guilt. I mean, here in Italy, this is really a difficult topic to deal with, not only in Italy, of course. And also, we were here. This is a fascist building with a strong memory of fascist discourse and, of course, of colonial discourse inside this. And a lot of people who participated in the performance had a relation, a personal relation with this history of colonialism and of fascism, because of their family, their parents participated in, so they felt allowed to engage a relation with the artist. So there was no distance. There was no position of comfort, or it was impossible to hide oneself in that small space. And I think that. I personally think that this kind of performances or activities or workshop with artists and so on works very well with small groups of people. So because if the aim of this work is to trigger transformative processes, I think that it is useful to work with small group of people and going in depth. And also constructing a non-academic, an informal atmosphere, so that people could feel allowed to express. Also, non-acceptable ideas, or because this is the problem here. We have to deal with this topic, also confronting with the uncomfortable side of this story, that is the feeling of nostalgia, for example. That is a big problem now, because colonial and fascists produced a lot of familiar and affective imaginaries. And so for me, it was we didn't have many money, so we couldn't repeat the performance many times. But it could be interesting to do small things, but repeat it in time. Thank you very much.
So, thank you both, Nora and Julia. And I would like to ask if there are some questions from the chat. I think so.
Can you hear me?
A bit louder, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, fine.
Okay. We have some questions. The first one is to Giulia Grechi, and I will read. Why show these images when we know they exist and you acknowledge the violence? This is a gesture that undermines the work of decoloniality and care. To say, I know this is violent, sorry, but could we reflect on the very practical decisions we make as a museum in terms of what we show, images, videos, and the words we use, and what this means for care?
I don't know if I understand correctly. It refers to the images of, is there written? The facial casts?
Of the facial casts.
Yes.
Mm-mm. Yes, I think I explained the reason why I showed this image. I totally agree with the fact that it's problematic to show these objects, and I was showing you that in a contemporary anthropology museum in Italy, it is normal to exhibit this kind of facial casts without a critical frame. So I was addressing this point, exactly this point, and moreover, in this museum, they expose this traditional way of exposing facial casts, and nearby there is a new mode of exhibiting these objects that the museum tell this is a critical way to expose this object, because the former one, the exhibit of the first 19th century, is not right today. So we made a new exhibit for these casts, and the new exhibit is quite similar to the former one. Just the faces are not in a chromatic order that was quite racist in the former exhibit. So I was addressing the difficulty of contemporary museums of getting this, of getting the point, and of how to expose this object itself is a risk to be a neocolonial act, because it is a museum that is exposing these materials. So it's a kind of refetishization of this object. It's a way of doubling the violence of the first act of appropriating these bodies through these objects, and to exhibit again this object, double this violence. I think that museums have to deal with this topic, but maybe in another way. Maybe we can show the documentation of how these objects were constructing, how it was the procedure, the violent procedure on that bodies while taking these casts, and not the object itself. So I want to show this image, and I said I'm sorry to show this image, that is, these objects are very violent, because I want to address, we are in a museum, in an ethnographic museum. Here in the colonial collection there are facial casts, and so this is a topic around which we have to interrogate ourselves and confront each other. How to expose it? We have to expose. We have to hide these objects. How can we hide the objects? I mean, how can we hide the violence without hiding the story of violence on this object? because I think we don't have to hide the colonial appropriation, the story of the colonial appropriation that produced this object. So it's quite a difficult theme, and I think this could be the place where to discuss it. So I hope I have answered to the question.
Thank you, Julia. Maybe Ralph would like to say something, and then we will back to the chat.
Excuse me, yes, I will be very short. Well, I had just a short chance to walk around this museum today, and I was really surprised, or maybe even shocked, when I saw 3 chances from Shuar, from Ecuador, in a showcase, without any explanation, without anything. But we know exactly that we should not show any more human remains in our museums, but this museum is actually changing. So I don't know. I wonder how come this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Can we have some more questions from the chat?
The first one is how to evaluate the fallout of performances of the type you described, and about the member. What about the members of the audience who attended it? And what about their reactions?
Okay, I think the second question I answered before about the reaction of people who participated in the performances. For the first question, I have some problems with the concept of evaluation of this kind of projects, because it's a kind of scientific approach to a matter that put into question also the concept of scientific way of looking at human relations and artistic practices. How can you evaluate the value and the impact of an artistic practices in a community? I am not a sociologist, and I don't want to be a sociologist. So for me, the value is in the awareness that this process can develop in people who participating in it. And when I talk about people who participating, I intend not only persons who attend the performance, but also the artist, the museum, the curators, all the subjects involved in this project. And I also think that one of the main problems of this kind of project is the control, is the urgency to control every step, everything. This kind of performances, the artist who works in this relational way knows that they don't have the control of the situation, that the unexpected can explode in a situation like this, and this is a part of the meaning of the performance itself. So I think that maybe it's difficult to evaluate this kind of processes, because maybe it's a sort of starting point of a reflection that people will elaborate in the following days or weeks or even years, and then at a certain point it will be an action, a change of point of view. How can you evaluate this? I mean, it's not my priority. My priority is trying to construct a situation where something can happen, could happen, or could not.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Some more questions from the on-site attendees or from the chat? I would just reply to Ralph saying that I cannot answer because I'm not a curator here. So I cannot really talk about the internal process, but if some of my colleagues would like to, I would be happy. Thanks. Gaia, Del Pino, thanks.
Me too, I'm not the curator of the American section that now is vacant, because, but they are false, they are not true. The problem is that they are exposed even if they are false, and there is no communication of it. So we have for sure to improve the communication of all the, not only of the American section, but of the American section, for sure. Thank you for your division. No, all the section has to be improved about communication. There are no explanations. Yeah, they are not true. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia.
You're welcome.
So, if there are no more questions, I think we can end this session and have a coffee break. And then we will back here at 4:15 o'clock when we will have panel 3, Building Plural Narratives from Contested Heritages, dialogues with the diasporas and stakeholders. So thank you all for your attention and participation. I would also like to thank Pietro Dalmazzo and Francesca Manuela Anselmo and Gianfranco Calandra and Gaia Del Pino for their help in this session. And thank you all.